Hello and welcome to Take Me Home, the podcast offering a social democratic alternative for the politically homeless. I'm Hilary.salt, the Deputy Leader of the SDP.
And I'm Sebastian Moore.
Sebastian, you have a new role in the SDP now as well, don't you?
I do, yeah, that's right. So I'm now the chair of the Northwest region.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
So we are both back in Manchester this week, so hopefully the sound will be a bit better. We are in the middle of the Christmas shopping and office party season. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if you had to fight your way through reindeer antlers and sequins and people dressed as elves or anything like that.
There was a choir doing some...
Oh, that's nice.
What do we call those? Carols.
Carols, yes.
There's carols just outside the library and I walked in.
Oh, superb. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry I missed that.
12 Days of Christmas, that's what I'm thinking of. That's what they were singing. I don't like that.
Do you not like that one? What's your favourite carol?
Silent Night.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Lovely.
Without a doubt.
So, we're going to follow our usual pattern in the podcast. So, we're going to do a couple of news items. Sebastian, I know you're going to be very brave and tackle Syria, aren't you?
Stupid, yes, very stupid.
And I want to talk about the equal pay cases in the wake of the news about the settlements in Birmingham. And then in Bring Me Solutions, we have Rachel Hayton, who's an educational psychologist based near Carlisle. She wants to talk about special educational needs. And then Culture Club will have a Christmassy theme. So, to Syria first, Sebastian.
Yes.
Do you want to give people a bit of an intro?
Yeah, you'll know we sort of mentioned this briefly last week. It just seems like we're in a big news period at the moment with lots of stuff going on all over the world. So Syria, as we said last week, the rebels were sort of making ground, and since then, and it's almost pretty stupid to talk about it because by the time this podcast goes out, a lot will have changed, no doubt. But since then, the rebels have taken Damascus, and the Syrian president Bashar al-Assad has fled to Moscow. I
like you doing all the correct pronunciations here.
Yeah, well, I'll try.
Sounds great.
No doubt I'll mispronounce a lot of this, and no doubt a lot of people will disagree with me because obviously something as contentious as this, it's very difficult to find agreement. So, just a little intro on Syria as a country. So, as with a lot of the Middle East, it's sort of an artificially created country. It comes from the Sykes-Picot Agreement during the First World War, where the British and the French agreed to divvy up the Middle East. And Syria was sort of created out of that, and it fell on the French side. So it was ruled by France until after the Second World War when it got its independence. And then mostly since then, it's been ruled by the Assad family. So Bashar al-Assad's father, Hafez, he ruled from the 70s until 2000, and then Bashar took over and has ruled really since then until last Sunday. And they are Alawites. So Alawism is a sect of Islam. Again, some people will disagree with that and say it's not even Islamic. And it's closely linked to Shia Islam. So Shia, which is the majority in Iran and Iraq, and also Hezbollah, a Shia paramilitary group. And Syria as a country, it's got 22 million people, and it spans from the Mediterranean all the way over to northern Iraq. It's bordered by Turkey to the north, Lebanon to the west, and even Israel. And there's a disputed area, the Golan Heights, between Syria and Israel. And then in 2011, the Arab Spring happened. I was a mere 15-year-old. I remember it quite clearly.
Yes, I remember that. Yeah.
And somehow, despite all the predictions, Assad managed to cling on to power, and he suppressed the people. You might say that his tactics were to come really back strongly against the protesters so that it would then inevitably erupt into an armed conflict, which he thought he could win. Whereas I think a lot of people see, if you look at other countries, the more sort of peaceful they were allowed to go on for, the more dangerous it was for the regime itself. And Assad had some key allies in Iran and Russia.
And still has.
And still, yeah, I mean, Putin's allowed him to go and seek asylum in Russia. The big change then that has happened recently is that Russia has had a lot of its focus, obviously, in Ukraine, and Iran is weaker than it was before. So Assad didn't have as much support as he would have done. and the rebel forces really took advantage of this. Primarily a group called HTS, which is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, and they were situated in the northwest of the country in a province called Idlib. But there are so many factions, so people might be listening to this thinking, okay, so it's the Syrian government of Assad against the rebels. Well, the rebels, they're endless, and when I say endless, I really do mean endless number of factions, because it goes all the way down to the point of villages that have their own militias. So it's impossible to know how many groups there are, but mainly you've got the HTS that were up in the northwest, you've got the Syrian National Army up in the north, which is backed by Turkey. You've got the Kurdish forces over in the east, as well as loads of other groups.
And all these groups have kind of joined against the old regime?
Kind of, yeah, because they had a common enemy. But there's also fighting between the groups. Literally just this morning, HTS have taken the city of, I think it's called Deir al-Zor, which is quite an oil-rich city in the east, and they've taken that from the SDF, which are the Kurdish force, which is kind of came out of the PKK, which is a group situated around Turkey, Iraq, in Kurdistan, which is designated terrorist group. So the origins of the SDF kind of come from that.
HTS is also a designated terror group in the UK, isn't it?
So this is what I found a bit weird, because HTS, they have their origins somewhat linked to Al-Qaeda, and it was formed amongst quite a few different groups, and they've since tried to distance themselves from Al-Qaeda. But yeah, they're an Islamist group. They're designated as a terrorist organisation, and they very much are the winners of this most recent conflict, because they managed to advance more quickly than the Syrian National Army. So they've taken the cities of Hama, Homs, and Damascus. So they're very much the kingmaker, if you like. And yeah, they're not a particularly pleasant organisation from by all accounts. And so I was quite concerned when on Sunday, walking through Manchester, you had hundreds and hundreds of people celebrating, dancing in the streets, flying the flag of what would probably be the new flag of Syria. And on the Curry Mile, which is a stretch in South Manchester, if anyone knows Rusholme, they were setting off fireworks, car horns, all the way through the night. And to me, it's if they're celebrating the fact that Assad, who was definitely a brutal dictator and did some awful things against his own people, then I sort of think, okay, fair enough. But I don't like the fact that they're basically celebrating when quite a dodgy group have sort of taken power in Syria.
I can understand kind of ordinary Syrians being relieved at the fall of the old regime. I guess the thing that for me is a bit more worrying is when some of our politicians start welcoming it, because, as you say, HTS don't seem to me an organisation that you would particularly put any trust in. I don't know if you remember when the current regime took over in Afghanistan. They said they were reformed and they were much more progressive, but the actual reality of what's played out in Afghanistan has been horrendous, especially for the women of Afghanistan.
Exactly, yeah, and I think it's be careful what you wish for, because I think this is really concerning in some ways, and obviously we don't know what's going to happen, and I'd like to share the optimism of a lot of people out there, but I do fear that worse is to come, especially when you consider the fact that a large section of the population is Christian. I think we're up to sort of 10% of the population, and I think that group of the country will be at risk. And for all Assad's faults, and whether this is true or not is sort of down to the detail, but he claimed that it was a secular society, so there were these so-called protections for minority religious groups that I can't see there being in the future. Just a little bit on what this sort of future does hold. So they've just as of yesterday, HTS have announced a transitional government headed up by a guy called Mohammed al-Bashir.
He's the person who's changed his name, is he?
No.
Oh, it's a different one.
The person who's changed his name is a guy called Abu Muhammad al-Jalani, and he's changed his name to Ahmed al-Sharar. Sorry, that was kind of his original name, and now he's kind of gone back to that. He's the leader of HTS.
Why does it matter? Why? What's the change in names about? Just explain that.
No, I really don't know. Yeah, no idea. Maybe it's that was his name whilst he was the leader of a military organisation, and now he's trying to position himself as potentially more of a politician.
Okay. But sorry, I misled you there. So it's not him you're talking about anyway. Sorry.
The guy called Mohammed al-Bashir, he was actually an engineer, and he was involved in the rebel movement as a sort of political figure more than a military figure. And he's been installed as the Prime Minister until March. So there's now a transitional government, at which point I guess the idea is to hold elections, but I don't have much optimism for a clear democratic process to take place. And we've seen this, happen in Iraq and other countries where we think, oh, okay, it's all going to be fine now because we've got rid of the evil guy. And we, certainly in the West, don't understand the underlying tensions between groups. And the fact that they don't have, a strong history of democracy. It's not like I think we have this liberal democracy fantasy in the West. And like you say, there's a lot of celebration from our politicians and, the BBC, for example, it's not, I think people have to understand the BBC is biased in this, and especially when it comes to international things, because the BBC is going to take the side of Britain, as perhaps it should, but just be aware of when you're reading reports on the BBC, they do come at it from quite a biased lens. There's this reporter on the ground, and I was watching a video of her saying, oh, there's happy gunfire all around me. And I thought, that's really weird. She's saying, all this gunfire around me, it's really happy gunfire. So they're very happy about it, the I guess the political establishment in the UK, but I don't think this is necessarily a win for the Syrian people.
It's certainly not black and white in any of this, is it? It's not a kind of good side and an evil side in all this. It's just...
Exactly, and this is why as soon as you go to talk about something like this, especially me, as I'm no expert in this, it must be made clear that as soon as you go to research something like, just Syria, you realise how complex it becomes. And I think most people are incentivised just to kind of say quick sound bites about these countries and not really look at it in detail. And the reason I mentioned the religious angle of this is that a lot of we don't understand, as I say, in the West about, and we didn't understand this in Iraq, about the religious angle of this, because we think, oh, they're all Muslims, aren't they? And then the fact that the Alawites are actually quite a small proportion of the population of Syria, which is majority Sunni population, and that HTS are a Sunni organisation. So the religious angle will play a role in this, for sure.
Well, that was really helpful, Sebastian. I've been really struggling trying to keep up with what's going on there. So thanks for doing all that research and explaining it all to us.
That's quite okay. I hope I explained it okay, and I hope I didn't get anything wrong. So apologies if I did, if anyone's listening.
On that note, perhaps I should also mention that we've had 3 people write in this week to say how much they're enjoying the podcast. So thank you very much to Sophie, Gordon and Stuart. If anybody else wants to write in, especially saying it's great, please do. But obviously, if you have anything that you want to raise as well, please do that as well. So are you okay if I move on to equal pay cases?
Absolutely, yeah. What's this about?
So people might have seen in the news that the reason this has come back onto the agenda is that Birmingham City Council have agreed a settlement in their 6,000 equal pay claims that were brought by not just current staff but previous staff. The first action in this was over 4 years ago, so it's been going on for quite a while. So the news is that they have reached a settlement which has been agreed with the 2 biggest unions involved, Unison and GMB. Lots of different numbers in the press about how much this might have cost. 400 million seems to be around about the number that people are settling on as being appropriate.
It's not public knowledge, is it, the final figure?
No, and obviously new cases might come out of the woodwork still. I thought it might be helpful just to set out what the kind of backstory to this is. So the first thing that I think it's really important to understand is that the council did not pay any woman less than a man for doing the same job, which is what you might think an equal pay claim is. Rather, what the tribunal decided was that some types of work done primarily by women, such as teaching assistants and carers, was of equal value to work done primarily by men, such as street sweeping and refuse collection. So because the way that the equal pay legislation works in the UK, you are required to pay people who do work of equal value equal pay, even if it's not the same job.
How do we deem something of equal value?
Who decides whether job A is of equal value to job
Yeah.
B? That's a really key question. And the short answer in these cases is that a court has decided effectively. But it does, it's in general, this is a real issue, particularly for big employers. So, for example, in the NHS, they have a really big job evaluation scheme. And the whole purpose of that is to avoid equal pay claims. So every job is assessed on a huge number of different characteristics. You know, how much responsibility do you have? How many people do you look after, you know, in the workplace? All those kind of things. So that every single position in the NHS has a job evaluation score to make sure that you don't pay unequal pay, so that you can compare kind of blood technicians with speech therapists who might be doing very different jobs to make sure that, you know, that you're avoiding the risk of equal pay claims. So that's effectively what will happen in Birmingham in all councils, is that we'll have a big job evaluation schemes to reduce the risk of this happening again. And we shouldn't underestimate how much bureaucracy that creates. In the NHS, if you create a new post, you have to have a job evaluation done on it. So, or if you change a post, you have to have a job evaluation done on it. So, you know, you get an army of HR people involved in assessing all these things. And in terms of what we're trying to do in improving productivity, that feels like that's not very helpful. So the question you raise is, you know, who decides? And that's a really important question. I mean, I think more generally, you might say, who's to say whether a nurse or a corporate lawyer is of more value? But the issue there is that they're not employed by the same person. So, you know, nursing done primarily by women is more poorly paid than corporate lawyers, primarily men. But that's not an issue for society in terms of equal pay cases, because they're different employers. But every time there's a big employer who employs people in lots of different roles, this is a problem with our equal pay legislation. The other really important issue that it kind of tends to knock out of play is the whole issue of supply and demand. So it is the case that you have to pay some people more to do a job that might be of equal value to another job. But, you know, if you look at Birmingham, for example, as an example, just as a for instance, if you're unable to recruit street sweepers, you have to increase their pay. But that means you now also have to increase the pay of a teaching assistant. And, you know, that the market doesn't work like that. So I think the whole way that equal pay includes work of equal value is problematic. Now, in some ways, I think rises in minimum wage levels do push some of this away, because obviously minimum pay is the same for everybody, so there's never an equal pay case. And you might say, well, yeah, let's just pay everybody more, then we don't have to have equal pay cases. But, you know, the market can't necessarily stand that kind of an approach.
Why can't we just say, you know, we'll pay street sweepers more than teaching assistants because we're struggling to employ street sweepers?
Because that would be unequal pay, and you would be subject to an unequal pay case.
Should that be the case?
I don't think it should, no. I think equal pay should apply to people doing the same job.
That seems sensible,
yes,
doesn't it?
Yes, I'm all for equal pay. I don't want anybody to say I'm arguing against equal pay.
Because to me, you'd say, well, how do you decide whether, you know, street sweeping is of equal value as a teaching assistant? And I'd say, well, see whether people want to do it or not, right?
Yes,
and if fewer
exactly.
people want to do it, you have to raise the wage.
So the other kind of big slug of cases in this area is the cases that have started with Next, the retailer. So their cases have been taken by, you know, one of these kind of ambulance chasing solicitors firms. And they have won the first round of their case that argues that shop floor workers, primarily women, are being paid less than warehouse workers, primarily men, for work of equal value. And again, the tribunal has decided that those two jobs are of equal value, and therefore there's a big equal pay claim against Next. Now, they're going to appeal that, so you've not got to the end of the legal process.
Do you know how they decide whether that's of equal value and the tribunal decides it? I just can't see how you'd possibly compute whether those two things are of equal value or not.
Well, they'll have heard evidence. So in the next cases from the legal team saying that, these are the responsibilities of a warehouse worker, these are the responsibilities of a shop worker, they are equal. And the tribunal has to decide whether that's the right argument or not.
Because as an employer, I would say, well, I'll show you whether they're of equal value or not. I'll put up a job advert and see which I know I get more applications from.
Exactly, yeah. But that whole supply and demand thing doesn't come into the picture. Now, the retail cases, I think, are really problematic because the solicitors firm who are taking these cases have said very, very openly that this will bankrupt Next. And that they have lots of cases that for other people like Tesco and all the big retailers, they think it will bankrupt Tesco and Asda. They think Sainsbury's will survive. But, if we decimate our retail companies, I just think that, A, that's not going to be helpful for, people buying their groceries, but B, it does mean that you will never again have an organisation that employs both warehouse workers and shop workers. So you'll effectively have to contract out the warehousing to somebody else. You put another, step in the chain of supply, and probably everybody pays more for their food.
And those warehouse workers will still be paid more than the shop assistants anyway.
Absolutely. And interestingly, at Next, there were quite a lot of women in the warehouses as well. It's just that if you looked at the stats, it was more male than the shop floor workforce.
Okay. Can I ask about Birmingham Council?
Yes.
So obviously they declared bankruptcy because of this equal pay case, and now the settlement seems to be lower than what they'd predicted. So there seems to be a lot more money now because they haven't had to pay out as much as they thought they were going to.
No, I think they're still really struggling financially. So I think there's another big rise in council tax coming for people who live in Birmingham. They've already cut to the bone all their service provision. Things like, what they spent on arts and culture is just completely gone. They're doing things like turning street lighting off. So
doesn't it seem wrong that if you're a Birmingham resident, you're having to pay more for your council tax because of the actions of the council, and because somebody that took a job as a teaching assistant or whatever, knowing what the pay was going to be, has now since got to pay out because of this unequal pay claim?
It does, and lots of people are saying, well, it's just because the council officers were incompetent. But as you've said, if you can't recruit street sweepers, you do have to pay them more, and it doesn't seem to me that that's necessarily been incompetence, although perhaps the management of the cases could have been done more effectively. But this is a real problem for, I think, all councils. It won't just be Birmingham who's affected by this. That might be the case where there's been all the number of cases and it's gone on for so long. I think lots of other councils, when they kind of saw that happening, have been able to, do something, job evaluation, that kind of stuff, to make sure that they're reducing their risk. But it is a problem for everybody.
I know one of the hardest bills that I have to pay is council tax.
Yes.
Because I go to pay it and I think, what is this getting me? And then I see that Manchester City Council have come out with some crazy harebrained scheme, or they're employing more DEI officials. I think, okay, why am I contributing for this?
Yes. And obviously we do have an opportunity to have some control over what our councils do in council elections. I don't think we've got any in Manchester, have we, coming up? But
not
certainly,
until 2026.
Yeah, I know there's some in Lancashire next year, aren't there, and across the country. So this is perhaps our opportunity to start, working hard to make sure that we can get some people in those positions of power.
Exactly, and if anybody's listening to this thinking, I want to be a councillor in Lancashire, then get in touch.
Please do, absolutely. In Bring Me Solutions this week, we're joined by Rachel Hayton, who is an educational psychologist and wants to talk about special educational needs, and in particular the way in which they have multiplied in schools and what are the reasons behind that. So as usual, we have some problems and some solutions. But we thought, Rachel, we might just start by saying, because you're an SDP member, why did you join the SDP?
So I found myself, hi, Sebastian, hi, Hilary. I found myself in the unenviable position of being a member of the Liberal Democrats and voting for Brexit. So clearly, It became very clear to me that I wasn't wanted there. Thank you very much.
A Lib Dem Brexiteer. Wow. There aren't many of those, are there?
Well, I think there's probably more than were thought of at the time. And because it was perfectly rational to me that we needed to have the sovereign, powers that belong to our country should have been with our country, not out supranational bodies. I realised, of course, later when I thought about it more, that because I'm not a globalist. I'm not a globalist. I love Great Britain. I love England. I love being English. I love everything about our cultural how we do things. So I used to I still do listen to various podcasts. I particularly like Spiked podcast. I liked some of the work of Brendan O'Neill, various other commentators of the day, and heard Rod and read The Spectator and other things as well. And I got round to thinking, I can't be on my own. I know I'm not going mad. I'm not on my own. There are other thinking, sane people who think that being in the European Union is not helping our country. So I found the SDP through much sort of humming and hawing, reading, listening to William, listening to other people talk about the SDP. And I think I made a donation, first of all, and then I joined last year or possibly the year before. I went to conference last year. I think I joined last year.
And of course,
probably in the spring.
You are our distinguished candidate in Carlisle for the general election.
I did stand in Carlisle, and 240 people voted for me who weren't related to me.
Fabulous.
And so I take that, to be a result.
Did you say 240?
4 of them were related to me. Well, I got 244, but, 4 of them were related to me.
Okay, that's 4 more votes than I got. I got 240, so you beat me.
Oh, did you? Yeah.
Right, so let's move on then to special educational needs. So Rachel, what are the problems?
Okay, so it seems as though there are a huge number of children now requiring an education, health and care plan. An educational health and care plan used to be, probably people might remember the statement, used to get a statement of educational need. And this was like the 3rd rung of a 3-rung ladder. So first of all, children's needs were to be met in school with their usual provision. The second rung is that they would be met with some additional help, maybe from an outside agency like speech and language therapy, for example, and then you've got the statement. Now, things have to happen within school, which are ordinarily available, and they can put measures in place. First of all, they have to identify that the child has got special educational needs, and then they have to put something in place. And then they need to try something additional, and then they come for an educational healthcare plan. The 4 areas of special need are cognition and learning, communication and interaction, social, emotional and mental health, and physical and sensory needs. I'll talk a little bit about each of those. So cognition and learning is to do with how children learn in the classroom situation. So whether they can concentrate, whether they can attend, whether they've got reading difficulties, whether they have trouble with maths, that would all be in the cognition and learning. Communication and interaction is not about speaking and listening, although that is part of it. It's about how well you're able to get along with people, whether you can collaborate, how well you are able to manage when somebody disagrees with you, or when you have a falling out, if you're able to make up. So some children struggle with elements of those tasks. Social, emotional and mental health is probably what people would think of as behaviour. So if a child has got what might be recognised as behavioural difficulties, we think of them as social, emotional and or mental health. And then finally, physical and sensory. So the sensory environment is really important to young people. So I was having a conversation earlier this morning about dry stone walling, would you believe? And the fact that a young person is outside, is able to be lifting heavy things, putting them in place, and can become quite skilled at that. But that need for physicality in learning is not just, it doesn't happen in school anymore. So one of the things that I was wanting to talk to you about, or with you about, was about looking at what has changed in education, and that has meant that some children are now find that they have additional needs. Okay. Now, before I worked in England, I worked in Scotland. And Scotland it's not that obviously has children with additional needs. First of all, it calls them additional needs. It doesn't call them special needs, which I think is a step in the right direction. But they don't have plans. They don't have what used to be statements. They have a multi-agency meeting to try and put things in place to help a young person, a child. So I wanted to talk about the difference between, or encourage us to think about the difference between different models of disability and impairment. Okay, so the physical model of disability sees everything as being a disability or an impairment that's located within the person. So, for example, so they become the problem. So they may be confined to a wheelchair, or maybe they can't get up steps, or maybe they can't see or hear, or maybe they have fits, or maybe they're unwell, maybe they need help from carers. That's the medical model. Whereas the social model says the problem is the disabling world, the environment is the problem. So it might be that there's badly designed buildings. But we have special schools. Is that disabling or enabling? So some people, there's a story that sort of does the rounds about a hearing impaired child who is included in a mainstream school, because, inclusion is what we're aiming for, but goes for an afternoon at the hearing impaired school and finds their community. Here are other people like me, so yes, we want children to be included and part of their community, but what is their community and what is their choice? You see what I mean? So if that deaf child feels that his community or that her community is with the deaf community, why are we putting them in a mainstream school where there are no other deaf children? They can't have fluent signing conversations because only one of them knows how to sign. That's not inclusion.
I did wonder whether the focus on inclusion was a sensible thing to do, because there must be other examples where actually it's not helpful for either the person with the special needs or the other pupils to be kind of changing the whole school routine to fit around that person who has special needs.
Yeah, well, I would agree with you. And also, where does the person or their family feel that their child needs to go? So we do say there's a presumption of mainstreaming. It can't be cut price. In order to facilitate, say, a hearing impaired child in a mainstream school, then maybe you need to have teachers of the deaf and teach everybody to sign. Why not, so that child can have equal and valuable social interactions with a peer group? Have they got a peer group that they can play with? So all of those sorts of things. So the inclusion came from the Salamanca Agreement, I think, in 1994. So maybe it's time for a review of that. But I also wonder whether actually by including some children, we're excluding other children. It's always a sort of double-edged sword, isn't it? So if we give, we make things right for them, then actually somebody else who can't do that, maybe somebody who's has a physical need, can't do the signing or can't sign fluently, and therefore is disabled in that way further. So I just wanted to think about, as I say, the social model of disability, where we're looking to change the environment rather than change the child. And I wonder whether with our current special needs programs, which are vastly expensive. For local authorities, I was reading, I think just at the weekend, that several local authorities are thinking that, once the cap is lifted in 2026, where I don't understand the accounting, I have to say, but the overspend by local authorities on their SEND budget has been written off till 2026, and then it comes back on. Well, they can't afford it. They can't afford to do this. And partly, I think the problem is the primary legislation, which says that a parent can ask for an EHCP, a plan, education, health and care plan, if they think their child may have additional needs, and if they think the school may not be able to meet those needs. May is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that.
And so you mentioned already, Rachel, that there's a real increase in these. In the number of children with plans. Why is that? It's not just that everybody's more unhealthy, presumably.
Well, as I say, I wonder whether or not it's because the environment has changed. So I go into school quite often. I very rarely see a child having fun in a school. And I can imagine people saying, well, children don't go to school to have fun. They go school to learn, but the primary way in which children learn is through play. So if they get to reception, and by the end of the Christmas term, that's the end of play done now for school. Now it's all just sitting still and learning, but they learn so many soft skills and life skills through play, whether it's to do with, as I was talking about earlier, to do with negotiating, turn taking, listening to others, being helpful. They learn those interactions through collaborative play, and also imaginative play, different types of play. That's their primary way that they learn, because their language skills are not up to scratch. They can't explain and articulate, many children, how they're feeling. I'm feeling really frustrated. I'm feeling bored. And so what happens when they can't communicate, if they haven't got the language skills, is that they behave, they act. That's why we say that behaviour is a form of communication. What is that child or young person trying to tell us? And partly they haven't got a means to communicate, so they act out, as people would say. Okay, I don't know if that's helpful or not.
I'll suggest an answer, and it won't be as academic as yours. If you're looking for these issues in children with special education needs or additional needs, you will find them. Right, and that's what we do nowadays. Yeah. We look for them, and so inevitably we find them. If I was a student in school now, there is no doubt in my mind that I would be diagnosed with at least ADHD. A friend was telling me recently, it reminded me of the fact that when I was in primary school, I would stand up to do all of my work. I was a very, very restless child. But the difference is that primary school probably recognised that and allowed that into the classroom. So they said, well, you can come up and write on the board, or let's do some group activities. So there's a lot of movement. And I actually thrived in primary school. Whereas if we medicalise all of these issues and we say, oh, this student's got ADHD, what that does is it tells the teacher, oh, this is something you've got to be very, very careful about. And it doesn't allow them to have just what you might call a community solution to the problem. And I think this fits actually quite nicely in line with the SDP, because we're not about these just constant top-down approaches. And the way that we deal with special education needs in schools is very much a top-down approach.
I would also say if 30% of children now are either autistic or have ADHD, that's not special. That's mainstream. That's normal. A third of people have got something. That's normal. We're not talking about 1% anymore, are we?
Exactly.
So maybe that needs to be thought about. So I will also encourage us to think about what are the pull factors. Why are people seeking a diagnosis? I can think of quirky kids I've known throughout my life who wouldn't have had a diagnosis and were able to thrive without a diagnosis. I don't know what they get. So that's the question. One of my questions is, what is the pull factor? Why is it interesting for people to find out more about what they might have, what might be wrong with them. And also this idea that we're all the same, and that and actually everybody's different. Everybody is unique. And
are there pull factors relating to things like that child then getting extra support with either additional teaching or things like, extra time and exams, all those kind of things. Is that what's causing some of this demand?
I don't know. I wonder about that. I also wonder what if there are any additional financial benefits, financial incentives to it for schools. If a child is able to have an education, health and care plan, it attracts additional funding to the school to help them meet the needs of those children. So I'm just wondering whether they come for the plan in order to do that. The other thing is, of course, that it can be quite a difficult physical job, certainly when some of the children may have some behaviours that are quite aggressive and violent. They can get hurt. It's not well rewarded, particularly, and they might find they'd rather go and, I don't know, work on a checkout somewhere instead, and not get that level of abuse, which sometimes happens. But I think it's back to creating environmental solutions that encourage, like you were saying, Seb, about, that you were able to stand up and move about. And I think things happen in primary schools where there is generally more flexibility. You stay with the same teacher all year. You're not moving between classes particularly. That teacher will get to know you really well, know what works, know what doesn't work. Whereas when you get to secondary, you're moving class to class maybe 8 times a day. Each teacher will have a different approach, a different way of doing things, different expectations. How are you as a young person able to negotiate those? And some people keep their head down and sail through. Other people like to get on with it and really engage with it. But a lot of children we know are leaving secondary school with very poor outcomes.
And you've outlined some potential solutions already, Rachel. What else do we need to be doing to address some of these problems?
Well, I think, I don't know what happens in teacher training, but I would like them certainly to have a proper or a thorough understanding of child development so that they understand what's to be, so that expectations of children are realistic, because I don't think that they are. And I think that some of the government requirements, for example, for let's say the Key Stage 2 SATs, are unreasonable. I'd also wonder about why, this is wider and you get an educationalist on really, why at the end of year 13 or year I can't remember what year it is anymore. Yeah, year 11, end of year 11, some children can leave school with no qualifications after 11 years of education. How is that possible? So it would really be useful to know what they can do. Can we be more positive about education and about what we get our children to do? But it all leads back to the basic question. I said I've got lots of questions for you. This is, what is the purpose of education? What do we want our young people to do? We want them to be able to get on with each other and with other people. We want them to be able to communicate. We want them to be able to think critically. I do anyway. We want them to be able to solve problems. I'd like to see the secondary curriculum be more to do with applied learning. You've learnt all this. Now, what can you do? My favourite psychologist, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, talks about play-based work experiences. Okay, so this would be things like building your common room and painting it. And if they could be mentored with a local builder or local painter, decorator, local electrician, that could be a sort of, it doesn't matter. At the end of the academic year, they could knock it down. And the next year group could build it, So it's about having experience that are to do with applying the skills and knowledge you already have to make learning meaningful and purposeful. I think so. You talked last week maybe, or a previous episode, about having a purpose. Children, young people, certainly in secondaries, need to know, why am I doing this? Why is this on my curriculum? What is the point? Because we know that not all children go to university or want to go to university. And one of my sons went to university. One of my sons didn't go to university. He's a builder. And the other ones that make sandwiches at the moment. At the moment, we're not there yet. But, they're both great lads and they've got more to offer than they could show at school.
And I think, Rachel, what you're saying is really important. And I think, as you say, we need to have a purpose. And I think, as you say, we need to have a purpose. And I think, as you say, we need to have a purpose. And I think, as you say, we need to have a purpose. And I think, as you say, we need to have a purpose. And I think, as you say, we need to have a purpose. And I think, as you say, we need to have a purpose. And I think, as you say, we need to have a purpose. And I think, as you say, we need to have a purpose. And I think, as you say, we need to have a purpose. And I think, as you say, we need to have a purpose. And I think, as you say, we need to have a purpose. And I think, as you say, we need to have a purpose. And I think, as you say, we need to have a purpose. And I think, as you say, we need to have a purpose. And I think, as you say, we need to have a purpose. And I think, as you say, we need to have a purpose. And I think, as you say, we need to have a purpose. And I think, as you say, we need to have a purpose. And I think, We've gone a long way away from special educational needs here now,
We have,
saying that
we
young
have,
people need a
sorry.
purpose, but I think it's all helpful.
I think it's really linked though, and I've worked in education ever since leaving school, and nowadays I tutor, so I give private tuition, and I have a lot of students that have special education needs, and to me it's not a thing. I don't really feel the need to treat them any differently, because you respond naturally to the needs of the student, whatever the needs are. And a lot of these students that I think have been written off in school, they have a lot to give, and they're actually, once you instill a little bit of curiosity within them, and you mentioned before we started recording about curiosity, is they do respond quite well to that. And I think it's an indictment on our education system more than it is on the needs of our young people.
Yes. Can I tell you a story?
You may.
If you don't mind. So before I was an educational psychologist, I taught in a secondary school, and I taught alternative provision, so those who were not on the main timetable, in Key Stage 4. And so I had the ones who struggled with their English and their maths. I had them for English, and their provision was great. They did 2 days with a local employer, and 1 day at college, and then 2 days in school where they did their basics that they were going to be examined in. And they were a handful, let's be honest. They were a handful. They didn't really want to be there. They'd rather have done 5 days at work experience. But anyway, I was out on not even thinking about this. And I was out with some friends, some mums from the school that my boys were at, and was talking about what a bad day I'd had or something. And one of the mums said, yes, Rachel, but you should see him with the cows. He is absolutely fantastic with the cows. He's so gentle. They recognise him. They love to come to him. He's so caring and thoughtful. So this was a boy that never wrote a word, sat, badly in his seat. When I was back in the class, I was able to say, I had a conversation about you the other night with somebody that knew you and was telling me how great you are and all this, and how lovely that was to hear. And having that child reframed for me in my head, having had that conversation, really made a difference to him, because I'd acknowledged that he had strengths and that he could do things, and that I knew he could do things. And it didn't particularly matter about the things he couldn't do. What really mattered was that he was making a difference to them on that farm. You see, so sometimes it's about trying to see the wider young person or the wider child who's got so much to contribute. And as you say, that thing about being written off is really damaging and destructive.
That's a really nice note on which to round off that conversation. I think. Thanks so much, Rachel. I've learned so much there. This is a whole new topic to me, so thank you for that. So that brings us then to Culture Club, and we've all got something to bring to Culture Club this week. Shall we start with you, Sebastian?
Yes, I did something cultural.
Wow!
So I went to see a performance of Handel's Messiah. So George Frideric Handel, who composed this piece called Messiah. And do you know, whilst I was there with a friend, she turned to me and she said, "You're only doing this so you've got something to talk about on Culture Club." I said, well, maybe. Have either of you been to see Handel's Messiah?
I've done some singing of it. So I mentioned the other week that I was doing the Couch to Chorus choir, online choir with Upper North, and we did the part of Messiah.
So it follows the structure of an opera, actually, even though it's not technically an opera, and it's in 3 parts. So for anybody that doesn't know, I mean, it's an orchestra with a choir, and the first part is about the prophecies leading to the birth of Jesus. So a lot of the Old Testament prophecies. The second part talks about the resurrection, and then the third part covers sort of Paul's teachings in the New Testament. So there's all of the words to the singing are taken from the scriptures.
You don't really need to know all that to enjoy it, though, do you?
I don't know. I suppose people can enjoy it on different levels.
Yeah.
I mean, annoyingly, so I went to see a performance by the Halle Orchestra at Bridgewater Hall here in Manchester, and annoyingly, the programmes cost £3.50. And I'm a cheapskate, so I said, no, there's no way I'm paying £3.50 for a programme. Luckily, the woman next to me had it out on her lap the whole time, so I was just reading over her shoulder. And I loved following along because you wouldn't necessarily pick up on the words, but for me it was it was wonderful. I'll play you a little bit of my favourite. It's very much a Christmas-themed thing. Like, it's just become a Christmassy thing, even though it wasn't intended for that in the first place. Famously, at the London premiere, the King, George II, he stood up during the Hallelujah chorus, which I'm sure everybody will know. Let me play it now.
They'll know it from The Sound of Music, I think.
So because George II stood up during that piece, Hallelujah, nowadays the tradition is that everybody stands up. So if you go and see Handel's Messiah, don't be alarmed when the whole audience stands up during that performance. Yeah, but I thought it was wonderful, spectacular. I'm not a musical person, but I really enjoyed it. And yeah, I'd suggest anybody, if they've got the chance to go and see it, I think it was a wonderful, wonderful experience.
So while we're on Christmassy things, I don't know if people saw in the news that the Bishop of London, Sarah Mullally, I keep getting blindsided by the fact that the church is all female now, isn't it? There's so many people like bishops that are women.
I know one of the first women who was ordained. I think it was 1994 they allowed ordination.
Yes, yeah.
That's right, because I went to her service where it was 30 years since she'd been ordained.
Ah, right, yes, yeah. So she was in the press saying that she thought it was very sad that we've kind of seen the end of collective television watching at Christmas. So everybody's in a different room doing their own streaming of a box set, of different box sets, whereas she says we used to have, she said, precious hours spent around the television, which I thought was a bit odd, really, because, you know, if you're going to talk about precious family time together, there's lots better things that you can be doing than watching TV. But Christmas is, I think, a time when lots of us who maybe don't watch very much TV during the year do fire it up again. Does anybody buy the 2 weekly Radio Times magazine?
I don't have a TV, so no.
I haven't done yet, but I often do, because we do love a movie in my family.
So there are a few things that people tend to watch at Christmas, aren't there? Certainly I love watching all the musicals, Oklahoma and all those kind of things. It's a Wonderful Life. I think many of us watch and weep our way through every Christmas.
Yes.
There's some specials this Christmas. I think there's a Gavin and Stacey special, which I'm looking forward to. I always like a repair shop at Christmas. Again, that's the one. Well, they people take like treasured possessions in, and they the team of craftsmen fix things, like clocks and stuff like that. It's always the old men and cry on there when their treasured possession is restored. There's a new Wallace and Gromit. I'm looking forward to that. So I think there is some quite good TV viewing to be had. My other BBC-related Christmas treat is listening to the Festival of 9 Lessons and Carols on Christmas Eve.
On Christmas Eve.
Yeah, so I thought I would bring that to Culture Club, a little discussion on Christmas viewing. Rachel, you had something different as well to bring to Culture Club, didn't you?
Because my husband and I are working our way through Day of the Jackal, we can't have another series on the go. We have to do one series, then we can have a different series. But we can have a film. So one of the films which I had downloaded was Moonage Daydream, which is the 2022 David Bowie biopic. And I didn't miss Bowie, because obviously Bowie spans many decades. But I was absolutely fascinated, not just by the music, but by how he himself was the work. He was curious about his life. He tried to understand himself, not just through his music, also through his art, particularly through sculpture, through acting, and through dance. I didn't realise he was such a good dancer, and he'd spent time with was it Julian Kemp? No, it's Lindsay Kemp. Lindsay Kemp had done some study with him, and was actually, his movement was fabulous, as well as looking at all the sort of interesting changes, outward changes to his hair, the way he presented himself, and how interesting that was, and sort of a little bit scary maybe at the time for some older people. Like, what's this, with the long hair and the makeup, but not trying to be a different gender particularly, just being curious, finding out, I want to know more about this. So it was long, but it was really, really interesting, and it has made me listen to more songs from the David Bowie back catalogue, which I really enjoyed. But worth of the view if you've got 2.5 hours.
He was a book a day man as well, wasn't he? He used to read a book a day.
Was he?
Day. Yes,
Didn't know that. Do you have a favourite Bowie song?
I don't know if I do. I think probably Starman, I would say, which is one of the early ones. But I remember being on a family holiday in Wales. I'd be about 12, with my brother, who's younger than me, and singing it and not getting the words right. But my father filling up our Morris Oxford, and the petrol was 37 pence a gallon. 37 pence a gallon. Remember that, Hilary?
I do. I'm looking at Sebastian's
Morris,
face now.
Oxford, gallon. Not sure what these words mean.
Yeah, so it always reminds me of that.
Great. Thanks, Rachel.
Yeah.
So I think that's everything we have for this week. So thanks again, Rachel, for joining us. That was a great learning exercise for us there. Thanks, Sebastian, for doing something cultured for once.
No problem.
Yeah, and thanks everybody for listening. We'll see you all again next week for our final pre-Christmas episode.